I had this game idea lodged in the back of my cranium for the longest of times, about a cartoony animal wizard blasting skulls with big eyes in a dungeon with very big rooms and very high ceilings. The closest analogy to the gameplay I had in mind goes as back as NES. Think of it as Galaga or Space Invaders, but in 3 dimensions. You would have to aim up across a 2-dimensional plane, but in addition to moving left and right, your character will also go back and forth deeper into the scene. I wanted to make a gameplay that would make the player look both upwards to aim at the enemies and downwards to position your character and avoid AoE attacks that spawn on the ground. There also should be several graphical cues to help you figure out the positions of your enemies in relation to yourself. I set out to make a playable, more or less finished version of this game in 7 days. Spoiler alert! By the end of those 7 days I still had a lot of stuff to add, so I extended the term with another 7 days. 14 days. 2 weeks to make a small, viable and functional game from absolute nothing. This is a day-by-day recollection of how it went down. I will not be delving into any precise details. This isn't a tutorial, after all, but I will be sharing some thoughts and techniques I consider interesting and or valuable. This is codename Bone Blaster. In game development, as with any other enterprise, there must be a proper order to things. Not in the sense that you have to do something in a certain order, but more so that following such an order will yield the most optimal result and would make sense in terms of progression. You don't put the cart in front of the horse, so to speak. I always like to begin with controls in my games. The first step is always to make the character move, make the cursor follow the mouse. This is what I spent half of the day 1 doing. Other half is spent trying to remember how Unity collisions work, which colliders and triggers interact with what, and how to treat moving objects versus static ones. You may have noticed there are 2 cursors here. The yellow one is 2-dimensional, and it shows where the mouse pointer actually is on the screen. The white one is a 3-dimensional sphere, which will never leave the play area and will more accurately show where your projectiles land in 3D space. On day 2 I get to the enemy design and, in broader terms, defining the overall art style of the game. The first thing created for the game will define how it is going to look, so it better be an important thing. I thought to myself, what is the most important piece of graphic here? The enemy. It must be the enemy. The main character doesn't play that big of a role. I could replace it with an abstract object and it wouldn't make that much difference. But the enemies, these guys will take all of the spotlight. In my head I envisioned enemies as floating animal demon skulls with big cartoony eyes. Of course, their overall design is over-exaggerated, cartoony, retro low poly looking. Their animations must be expressive, their colors must be bright and saturated. I have this problem with colors, a tendency to undersaturate them when I draw, resulting in a rather bland and bleak look. I keep this in mind and later I will fix this issue with the use of color filters. I prefer painting textures in 2D software instead of directly on the model like sculptors do. For this I need to put some proper time into UV unwrapping. However, in this case I don't need to be too precise with that, since the game must look a little crooked and old anyway. Some UV islands I try to keep symmetrical and straight so that it's easier to paint the textures over them. Now onto the eye. It must open and it must close, which I achieve with the shape key. First I draw the iris directly onto the eye, but then it doesn't look right when it closes. Instead, place the iris on its own plane with transparency, and move it deeper into the eyeball so that when it closes it shall obscure the iris. Day 3 was when I got around to making the room. I only had a vague idea of how it should look. I referenced this specific texture from Medieval for the stone pattern, made a rough sketch for it, and then quickly built it in Blender. Some adjustments here and there, then UV unwrap everything and fit it in a single image. I've gotten into a habit of drawing shadows directly onto the vertices of the terrain. It is an unflexible way of doing things, but it achieves the desirable retro look. In the end, I make the geometry crooked a little bit for that dungeon keeper aesthetic and see how well it all fares in the engine. Day 3 is also when I begin rigging and weight painting my skull. Nothing too fancy, a bone for a jaw and the tip of the nose is all we need. Since this skeleton is so simple, I animate it directly in Blender, whereas for more complex characters I prefer a little thing called Cascadeur. I'll get to it later. I need idle, attacking and hurting animation. Death is optional. When these are ready, export everything into Unity and fiddle around with importer settings, which is not at all an intuitive process. Onto the eye again. First, insert it into the skull prefab under the proper parent. It needs to open when the cursor is near and close when it is far, giving the player a hint as to whether the spell shall hit the bastard or not. As I finally figure out the ins and outs of Unity's collision structures, it is time to make a projectile. A simple crystal-shaped object with one rectangular strip acting as its entire texture. We have to save all the space we can in this economy. I make it a bit brighter, more vibrant, more juicy, add some white at the edges. When it's up in Unity, make a prefab out of it. The spell will be governed by its own code. It will fly along its forward axis and process collisions as it does. These large captivating eyes aren't just for mere show. They must also follow the player cursor, and so they do. Another small tidbit. I gotta put some stupidly simple shadows underneath everyone. This is to give additional information on where everyone is located in 3D space at any moment in time. Put some shining glowing effect, which is also stupidly simple, behind the projectile. And now enemies can shoot the same projectile back at me. Make sure the collisions work properly. Another layer of visual information is shading the skulls that go further away from the character's front to back position. Makes it easier to understand which enemies you can hit and which ones you can't. Also throw some spell explosion effects into the mix, just for good measure. Time to put some of the U into some of the I. I personally have a specific taste for diegetic or unconventional user interfaces. That is why I did not just put 2D sprites on a canvas and call it a day. Instead, I'm making these heart objects that will have 3 states: full, half and drained. And I'm hooking them up into a health management script. Boom! Simple and stylish. Since these hearts do not even have an armature, I am animating them straight inside Unity, because I don't want to deal with extra complexity by using Blender's animation systems. This is where I run into my biggest question yet. How do I actually spawn waves of enemies? How do I make different waves? How do I keep track of whatever enemies are left alive? I actually had zero ideas how to do it. Each skull have to follow its own path? Does the wave manager dictate which skull follows what path? I was trying to make this game fast, so I went with the first idea I could see working. If I ever get back to this project, I will probably have to redo this whole system again. I have prefabs for each combination of attack and movement in a skull. There's a skull that shoots simple pellets and goes back and forth. Then there is a skull that goes in circles, a skull that follows the player. Each skull knows how it has to move, based on a spline contained within it in a prefab. Then I create a wave prefab and put different skulls into it, changing their routes if I need to. This is the easiest way I could come up with on the fly. Problem: what should happen to the skulls that reach the bottom plane? Solution: turn them into homing torpedo missiles that follow the player until they explode and deal damage. This works as an incentive to kill all of the skulls in their wave fast before they can reach the bottom, because then you're getting hurt by them. There is no way around it. Time for mana. Same principle as with the HUD, but make it into a chunky lightning bolt. As I do this, I decide to redraw the HUD too, so that it's a bit sharper and more crystal-y. It doesn't take long and looks objectively better. Objectively. Next, I rework enemy projectile to be more evil and distinct from the player projectile. I also come up with a vortex thingy that is spawned on the ground to deal damage to the player and shrink down the walking area for a few seconds. It will make you pay more attention to the projectiles, and it is more dangerous and it needs more effort to avoid than the regular pellet. I can't tell you how many times I had to rewrite and redo everything about how enemies and spells work. It is when you try to do things fast and then in horror realize what mess you've made, that is when the true coding begins, when you have to clean all that mess. Now we move on to the character. I've sketched a quick shitty image to keep me in check in the most loosest of terms. I usually begin modeling the character from the torso and the legs. Deciding how detailed the model is going to be begins right here and now. Now, I don't know how to put this into words exactly, so bear with me. So in low poly, a leg is essentially a cylinder, right? A cylinder has a specific number of sides. A cylinder with 4 sides is pretty much a square. Some of the models I've made in the past had legs and arms made of 4 sides. You can do with 3 sides for legs and arms, like Warcraft 3 did that sometimes, as well as some other old as hell strategy games. A leg with 6 sides is a little bit too detailed for my taste now. Diablo 3 characters had 6-sided leg cylinders in some cases. I personally like a 5-sided leg. It looks crunchy but also gives you the illusion of a smooth cylinder from every angle. Post in the comments how many sides in your legs you like. Day 10 is all about character creation. Modeling, rigging, texturing, fixing and polishing. As long as I'm working in a very low poly territory, I do not need to worry about how things connect to each other. I've separated the character into 9 parts: head, body, hood, arms, legs, hands. Hands' fists are separate too because you can get some nasty twists at the wrists when they are connected to the arms. Usually, the most egregious areas in terms of mesh deformation are pelvis leg joints and shoulder joints. The former I will be able to hide under the robe, and the latter I won't deal with at all because arms are not going to be connected to the body. They will float next to the torso like they did in early PlayStation games. As for the rigging, I'm using a basic human skeleton with not too many bones. No fingers on the hands, but I do add weapon bones for right and left hand. Among the additional elements there will also be a bone chain for the hood and its tassel. I am not going to be using cloth physics for the skirt of the robe, so instead I rig it with 4 bones attached to the root bone of the armature, which is the hips. This here is why you should always be careful with automatic weight paints. If you're working with a mesh that has a lot of split parts, not a simple uniform mesh, it messes up which bones control which vertices and how much do they control them. I mean, just look at this. It takes longer to clean this up than to go from scratch. So that's what I do. Adjust the hairdo a little bit so it doesn't clip when I move the head. Spoiler alert, it doesn't matter in the end. Don't waste your time on little details when your character looks like this from afar. Then again, if you can fix some small mistake in a few seconds, then why wouldn't you do it? UV unwrapping. Figure out where are the best places to put seams, straighten up the stuff that must be symmetrical or looping back on itself. Move and scale things around so that they are more or less in the same detail ballpark. And that's it. Texturing. I personally try to avoid using too specific or too complex brushes, because later I can never replicate or reconstruct this process. There really isn't anything complicated you have to do when working with textures like this. You don't rely on the physics-based lighting to do all the work, so you draw all the highlights, all the shadows, all the creases, and etc. into the texture itself, by hand. All you have to do is place stuff where it needs to be, like darker under the armpits, brighter on the chest, wrinkled at the points of bending like elbows and behind the knees, and you're all set. Everything else is the question of design and execution. I start with a rich blue for the coat, but then pivot to emeraldy bluish green, one of my favorite colors by the way. And in the end, it looks as good as it needs to be. I finally bring the character into Cascadeur, a cool little software that has a bunch of gimmicks which I don't use. But I like it for how intuitive the basic process of animating is. Sure, you have to construct a rig inside of it and then pass it back into Blender for proper exporting, but it's kinda worth it. You want ghost outlines? A feature that any animation software has? Blender doesn't have it. You want to switch between IK and FK on the fly with only your base armature? In Blender you have to do all that manually. I also like shortcuts here better. I begin working on animations and then I notice some stuff I don't like about the armature. So I go back to Blender to adjust my rig. 2 days. 2 days have just fallen out of my calendar. I don't even remember what happened during those 2 days. I sure as hell didn't do any work then. Once more, I need 5 animations. Idle, run, shoot, hurt, and die. Idle is usually easy, the character just bobs down and up as if breathing. Running is the bread and butter of it all. Whatever game you're playing, run animation is the one you'll be seeing the most. If you mess up your running, the player will be staring at it long enough to notice all the errors you've made. I add hood movements for the little oomph. I angle the head a little bit upwards because enemies will always be above the character. It makes sense if the model looks up all the time. Shooting animation will be a skip hop jump with a flinging motion of the staff. At the highest point above the mage's head is where the spell will be fired from. Hurting animation is a bit silly and cartoonish. Exactly how I want it to be. The more pronounced it is, the better. I model another skull with slightly different horns, so that the player could tell from a glance what attack will this particular enemy use. I implement a spawning animation for the skulls. Now, instead of just popping into existence, they de-shrink to normal size and rotate around. Another small thing that the game needs is some kind of counter for how much time has passed and how many enemies have you destroyed. I draw some simple icons and then put them on a plane that slides up from the bottom of the screen when you move your cursor down over there. Day 16 is when I finish the last animation for the main character, the death animation. I also decide to rework the skull texture in such a way that I can use one material for different color variations of the skulls. The idea was to give the enemies different colors based on the complexity of their attacks, but in the end I am only using the regular and red variants. These last 2 days are mostly spent cleaning things out, making small adjustments, and adding little insignificant things to make the experience a bit fuller. I test the game from start to finish, make sure everything clicks together and doesn't break. And that will be it. 16 days, minus 2, so 14 days, 2 weeks, to make a small prototype that can be played from start to finish. This included refining the idea, sketching the designs, modeling, rigging, animating, coding, polishing, testing, every single thing made by hand, by one person. Bringing this game to a legit conclusion would require adding more mechanics, more spells, more enemies, and some kind of a meta progression. I would like to get back to it someday, but I need to come up with a more interesting way of spawning and handling waves of enemies. Right now, it is serviceable, but again, since this is the easiest way I could come up with, it isn't the best I can imagine. It should be closer to something like Galaga, but in 3D. I don't know how it has to look yet, but hey, my opinion is as follows. Before you can come up with a correct solution, you must first see the wrong one through. I could finish this game, but I'd like to rework wave mechanics drastically, and I don't think I'm ready to do that just yet. I have refined my vision of this project during these 2 weeks. That's all I can take for now. Oh shit, I forgot about sound.